Ladies and gentlemen. I've been on programs this morning already with Stormfront. I've been on Patrick Ryan's show last night. Today I'm looking forward to a very deep, thoughtful, and fact-filled discussion with Mark Collett of Great Britain, a comrade, a lover of our European peoples, not just the British people, a lover really of human rights. And we are in a very solemn period right now. I was on the phone last night with a friend, an academic friend at the university where I studied for and achieved my doctorate. And I won't give the name, obviously, in these times, but she is a very dedicated person. She loves Ukraine. She also loves Russians, and they have a very long connection up until 10 years ago, before the Jewish propaganda came pouring into the country on a massive scale through social media and Facebook and Twitter and Google and the broadcast media and the crushing global media. 70% of the people of Ukraine felt favorable toward Russia. And they didn't want to take the path of Europe. They didn't want to have massive African immigration to the country. And that's all changed now. They've been producing this hatred. And now we have Europeans, once again, cutting each other's throats. And in terms of justice in this thing, I think Russians are right in the sense they don't want nuclear weapons at their border. No country would. They felt like they had to do this. They felt like their back was against the wall. But this is a tragic period. And this is a period more than ever that we've got to expose this cabal that's controlling the Western world, controlling the media, controlling our politics, demonizing Russia, and creating this war that's not only going to hurt Russia ultimately in terms of economics, and the demonization they're doing is incredible, and Russian soldiers. It's also going to hurt Ukrainians. It's going to hurt, it's a great danger for all Europeans. And I can't think of anybody better to have a good discussion with this, and a shared discussion with on this matter than my good friend Mark Collett of Great Britain. Welcome to the show, Mark. And I'm really glad to have you on to really go a deep dive into this issue and talk about the ramifications for what's happening right now and the meaning and the danger it presents to European mankind, but also maybe some opportunities to expose the real orchestrators of this insanity that we have in this world today.
Well, thank you for having me on. Obviously, when I woke up on Thursday morning, I went to bed on Wednesday evening, and I had just done a show with Eric Stryker. I just talked about all of this. And from my perspective, I didn't think Putin was going to go in, and he did. So I was wrong about that. But I stated that Putin does have a very good reason for doing this. And whenever you talk about war, you have to talk about how you came to the position of war. That's the most important issue initially. Obviously, you need to have an understanding of the region, what's going on there, and how this kind of thing could come about. And honestly, this is not Vladimir Putin's fault. This is the fault of, and I wouldn't say it's the Ukrainian people's fault. This is the fault of NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has basically been pushing forward its boundary and taking more and more of Eastern Europe. Now, on the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, NATO had a verbal agreement with Russia that on the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there would be a permanent buffer zone between NATO, which NATO powers began in West Germany, and Russia. So Eastern Europe was not to be rolled into NATO, and Russia was not to basically take Eastern Europe either. So essentially, there was a buffer zone between Eastern Europe and Russia. Between Eastern Europe was the buffer zone between Russia and NATO. Now, that seems to me to be a reasonable agreement. I think that's a reasonable agreement because, obviously, I don't want to see war. You don't want to see war, and you're more likely to have war if you've got people pushing their militarized zones or their boundaries right up against other people's boundaries. And a buffer zone between NATO and Russia, to me, seems like a fair and reasonable idea. However, ever since the end of the Cold War, the people who have broken this agreement are, in fact, NATO. NATO has aggressively expanded its influence throughout Eastern Europe. And now you've got a situation where the Ukraine, or Ukraine, whatever you want to call it, was talking with NATO, and there was a very real prospect of NATO bases being placed in eastern Ukraine. Now, that would have been right up against Russia's land border with the Ukraine. And I understand that Vladimir Putin does not want that. I understand that Vladimir Putin is going to say, absolutely no way on earth am I going to let that happen, because that is a threat to Russian sovereignty, it's a threat to the Russian people, and it's basically a threat to his power. It's a threat to the Kremlin. Just as it was a threat to Washington and America when Russia and the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the de-escalation of that was the Soviet Union and Moscow withdrawing those missiles. But here, in Ukraine, there hasn't been a de-escalation. NATO have refused to de-escalate this. They've refused to budge. They've refused to meet the reasonable demands from Moscow. And because of that, what has happened is Vladimir Putin, Moscow, Russia, they have acted decisively by invading to prevent American imperialism, or the spread of American imperialism. And they're not alone in doing this. They are being backed 110% by China. So two of the three world global superpowers are behind this, are on board with this, and believe this is right. And the European Union, quite crucially, is staying neutral. It's basically America and Britain that are leading the charge against this. But I've got to say this, because this is also very important. When NATO gets influence over a country, that influence is naked American imperialism. And American imperialism is globo homo. It's LGBT. It's feminism. It's attacks on Christianity. It's attacks on the traditional family. It's anti-white rhetoric. All of these Eastern European countries that have done deals with NATO have done deals with the devil. And once NATO is in control, once American imperialism filters down into that Eastern European nation, it is a poison that corrodes the moral fabric of that nation. So I believe NATO's activities in Eastern Europe are bad because they bring about war. They're bad because they antagonize Russia. And they're also bad because the message and the ideologies that they push are basically the messages and ideologies that destroy white people, reduce our birth rate, and end up bringing about white genocide. So all in all, I think the bad guys here are NATO. I think they are the ones that brought this about. And if Russia had sat back and done nothing, that would have been surprising. But also, if NATO and America had got hold of Ukraine, that wouldn't have been good for the Ukrainian people either.
The only thing I can really add to that, and I think that was a very good analysis, is one thing that I always tell our people, and one thing I keep repeating again and again and again, that even the definitions, even the way they have us describe things, it's so important to speak about how they control the language. When they talk about America, or they talk about NATO, or they talk about the EU, or they talk about global media, or all these impactful elements, they're not really talking about, when they say about America, they're not talking about America. They're not talking about the American people, the interests of the American people. They're not talking about the true interests of America. They're not talking about the true interests of the EU. They're not talking about even the true interest or whatever it was originally for NATO, which was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was to contain Soviet communism, they're not really talking about those institutions. They're really talking about the people who control the institutions. And it's really important, I think, for all of us to repeat, and I've been repeating this again and again and again. This is not American imperialism. It's Jewish imperialism. It's Zionist imperialism. It's Zionist globalism. And the country that we call the United States of America, not the country, not the people of America, but the government of the United States, is an absolute mortal enemy of the American people, the interest of the American people, of all the people, not even just white people, but also, of course, the interest of the founding white majority that created the nation. It has launched a policy, as you know, to destroy our borders. We're being invaded by millions of non-Europeans, the same way the EU has been trying to force member states to accept millions upon millions of radical Islamics, and also Africans and all sorts of other people into Europe that are changing the demographic of the country and therefore destroying the fundamental rights of the people of Europe. So it really is important to understand that when we talk about the EU, it's really kind of like the Jew-U, not the EU. It's the Jewish Union that controls it. When you talk about America, it's not the USA, it's the Jew-SA. I mean, really. And I'll just give you an example. If you'll give me a minute, I'm sorry to go in details, but it's so important people give foundations, because these foundations are never really talked about in the media. They're never talked about in the so-called conservative controlled opposition media. But I'll just give you an example. Let's take a look at this policy that's going on in Ukraine, this anti-Russian policy. Who controls it? Well, it's really coming right out of the executive branch. And of course, that's Joe Biden, who is a goy, but he's a Shabbat goy. He's a demented, cognitive, and memory impaired and challenged puppet president who's completely controlled by his chief of staff. The average president, anyway, doesn't have time to decide what papers come across his desk, to examine issues. He reads the speeches that his people give. And when he talks about the national security of the United States, he deals with the National Security Council of the United States. And who are the people on the National Security Council? Who are the people? So first off, his chief of staff, as a guy that decides basically what Biden does and what he sees, his name is Ron Klain. He's a Jewish supremacist, a radical Jewish racist supremacist who's radically supporting the state of Israel, goes to Israel all the time, hobnobs with the head of the Mossad, the head of cybersecurity for Israel. Later, he coordinates with them. This is an organization, the Mossad, that spied on people. The Mossad also was trying to undermine your country, including trying to get the Prince Andrew, right, on videotape and a criminal acts with young girls that if they ever, even, they probably have these even today, but the British government is not doing any investigation of this Zionist spy ring, which was all Jews, which were in partnership with Jews who had Israel and headed the Mossad and the Israeli intelligence organizations of Israel. How many other Britishers? We know that Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, whose real name isn't Maxwell, it's not a British name, it's a Jewish name. We know that he was the most famous Israeli spy in the history of Israel. We know he's buried in Mount Olives, which is the spot reserved for the most dedicated Jews of Israel. We know that every member of the Mossad went there. Why isn't the British government investigating and trying to find out what Gentiles, because I'm sure, by the way, you can be sure that all those tapes that they made on the pedophile island in the James Bond Mountain, which is paid for by Wexner, more Zionists in Israel, and Epstein was in partnership with Ehud Barak of Israel. And by the way, the Jerusalem Post just 2 days ago came out and pointed out to their Jewish readers that Barak was actually behind the whole Jonathan Pollard spy case in America, which was the most damaging spy in American history. He was in partnership even with Epstein. This was an Epstein Jewish Mossad spy ring. So this is amazing. Now, you'd think that this would be in the British media, in the BBC. You'd be thinking that this was with questions before Parliament is when is the government going to investigate and find out what other Britishers were attempted to be compromised and made assets into a foreign country, a spy, an asset of those countries, like like one of your members of the royal family, and to find out what damage they have and who's been compromised by them. There's been no investigation in America. The media in Great Britain, except for a very couple of very small fries, but the BBC has made no mention about the fact that all these people are Jews, and all these people have ties with the Mossad, with the Israeli government, that the three main people that were prosecuted were, of course, none other than the French guy, but he wasn't French. He was Jewish. His name was Brunel. He supplied Epstein with 3 12-year-old girls, right? He was an Israeli spy. We got pictures of him with the Israeli army hat. Gilad Maxwell, whose father was the biggest spy for Israel. Epstein, who was in partnership with the former head of Israel. And there's not even a mention that these people are Jews. Imagine if they were Russians. Now, you have this massive spy ring, you have this massive effort, and we have massive crimes by Israel. For instance, like the British government, the American government, demanded in the Security Council, along with the United States, that Israel vacate the Golan Heights, which is a huge bit of land, almost like the size of Switzerland, right? That was stolen from the Syrian people. They completely tyrannized those people. They drove them out. They put them in their prisons if they objected to it. They moved Jews into the country to control this country against their will. Was there any demand for, did we threaten to go to war against Israel? No, we didn't even stop sending our money. So these things are important. So who's in the National Security Council? Well, let's just I'll give you the names. You can go to Wikipedia and look at it, folks. And there's similar things are going on in Britain and Germany and France and other countries too. So you have Joe Biden, who, by the way, in the Kennedy School of Government, admitted that our allies, the Saudis, were supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, and the Israeli government was supporting them, right? This is really factual truth. This is the same Al-Qaeda that did 9/11. But there's no mention of this in the major media. Anthony Blinken is the Secretary of State. The two underneath him are Zionist super warmongering Jews, Nuland and Sherman. Another member of the National Security Council agency is Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, used to be head of the Federal Reserve. Lloyd Austin, he's Secretary of Defense. Now that's a black step and fetch it, Shabba's black goy, doing anything the Jews want. Merrick Garland, Attorney General, he's a member of the Security Council. His real name is Merrick Garfinkel, right? Alexander Mayorkas is Secretary of Homeland Security. This is a super Jew who brags in his biographies and in the stories about him. He was not. They call him a diversity member of the Biden cabinet. When the fact is, he's not a real Hispanic. He identifies not with the Spanish people. Yeah, his ancestors lived in Spain, but they were Marrano Jews who hated Spaniards and who hated Christianity, who lied and said they were Christians while they secretly practiced Judaism and uttered curses and ceremonies cursing Jesus Christ and Christians, right, for centuries. And they brag and boast about this, right? He's head of Homeland Security. And then you have Avril Haines, who's Director of National Intelligence. And I know that you're not an American and you're not as familiar with the roles of these offices. So Director of National Intelligence, that is like the epitome of the secrecy and the power of our intelligence and our government to make decisions about what governments do. Well, the head of the Director of National Intelligence is Avril Haines, also a member of the security agency. She's a Zionist, an open Zionist. Her mama was Rappaport. She goes to Israel. She's probably got a dual citizenship with Israel. She is very close to heads of the Mossad. She collaborates with the Mossad, the same agency that committed the biggest spy damage on America in any spy in history, Jonathan Pollard. Right? And as I mentioned, Ehud Baruch, who was head of Israel, they just had a Jerusalem Post article pointing out that he was that he was actually right involved with the Jonathan Pollard spy case, right? And so this is April Haines. And in America, you always hear about the CIA and the FBI and NSA and cybersecurity, DOD, and all this other incredible tyrannical facts who control America. Guess who they all report to is April Haines. So I hope all of our listeners and all the people listening to this around the world understand that when we talk about American imperialism or America, or when we talk about the EU, or we talk about Great Britain, or we talk about France, we're really not talking about the French. We're not talking about the British. We're not talking about the Germans. We're not talking about the Americans. And when we talk about the American government, it is not the American government, but a government that's controlling America who is loyal to a whole different nation of Israel and loyal to a different people than the American people. So I just wanted to make that straight, and so people understand who is doing this warmongering and doing this evil. And of course, they're totally combined with the total Jewish control over the mainstream media and the biggest media corporations, the 5 biggest in the entire world, which has as much monthly income as the next 50 to 100 media corporations in the world. They're all Jewish corporations. We're talking about Google and Alphabet. We're talking about AT&T. We're talking about Disney. These are global media that is demonizing Russia and promoting war in this country. And this is a war that is just as damaging to the Ukrainians as it's going to be to the Russians. And they're trying to destroy the Russian economy. And they're endangering a possibility of a world war. And this is one of the most evil things I think I've ever experienced in my lifetime. And I've seen a lot of evil from our government and from the Zionists who rule. Sorry for being so long, but I thought it was real important that people get a really fundamental understanding that this is not America. This is not Britain. This is not France and Germany. This is the people who control our countries, which are not for the people of our nations. I hope that's worthy.
So what do you think is going to happen next in Ukraine then? Do you think that he will take Kiev by the weekend? Because I think the big issue here is really, I talked earlier about the reasoning behind this attack and behind this invasion. But I think next is to see what is trying to be achieved. Now, there's large areas of Ukraine which are filled with Russian speakers, with people who are ethnically Russian, with people who actually do want to be part of Russia. Now, I believe in the right and self-determination of these people. And there's a big distinction to be made here. This isn't sort of like Pakistani Muslims in the UK who have moved here in the past 30 years and taken somewhere over. These are people whose families have lived there for generations and are indigenous. And what you've got to remember is the creation of parts of the Ukraine and of many Eastern European countries is really the worst of multiculturalism. And what I mean by the worst of multiculturalism is that when you look at the Ukraine and you look at different people, like Czechoslovakia was not a country. Czechoslovakia was Slovakia and the Czech Republic. And obviously now they are separate countries. And under communism, several of these countries were created. Several countries were created, which were the merging of several different genuine nations. And this pushed different ethnic groups together. And those ethnic groups had a claim to their territory, but were being forced to live and share power with another group. And I think that's very important, because when people say, well, if the ethnic Russians don't like living in the Ukraine, why don't they return to Russia? It's not as simple. It's not like saying, oh, well, look at these Somalians living in the UK. You know, they do not have a claim to the UK. But these ethnic Russians do have a claim to the land that they're living on. They have a claim to that soil because they've always lived there. And these borders have been redrawn so many times to create essentially multicultural nations, which obviously created huge problems in the 1990s when, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there were conflicts all over Eastern Europe as the borders were redrawn again to dissolve these multicultural, created, unnatural nations which weren't one single ethnicity. And I think what you're seeing here now is something similar. Now, I believe that obviously Vladimir Putin is going to push on. He is going to take Kiev. And when he takes Kiev, that is going to be a very interesting situation to see how things play out post the taking of Kiev. Because if he takes Kiev and at that point decides he's going to keep the whole of the Ukraine to himself, that would be slightly more problematic, because I don't believe he has the right to the whole of the Ukraine. He does have the right to bring under his care those in the Ukraine who are of Russian descent and are living on what was historically Russian land. That's a very important distinction. And I think this is something that doesn't get over very well or at all in the Western media and is largely ignored, because this isn't simply a war of conquest or a war of aggression. This isn't about a land grab. There are many, many very, very complex issues of ethnicity, issues of sovereignty, and all of these things are basically have to be addressed. They're very complex issues, but they're never going to be addressed because the people in charge don't want to address them here in the West, because Western people will never be told the truth of this matter, because obviously what we're seeing in the West is just wall-to-wall anti-Russian rhetoric with very little context whatsoever. So my interests here, Neil, are really what because Vladimir Putin was definitely justified in invading, but is he justified in his next steps? Well, first, I think we'll have to see what his next steps are. And if his next steps are to take Kiev and then roll back and say, look, I'm not keeping the whole of the Ukraine, which I think is untenable anyway, because there'd be a guerrilla war against him. Many Russians would die, and that would be very unfortunate. Tensions would rise, and there'd be many deaths on both sides. But if he takes Kiev, then rolls back and forms a new border around the areas that are filled with ethnic Russians, I think that's very, very justifiable. And the last thing I want to see is a long, drawn-out guerrilla conflict, because I think that would be disastrous for all involved, and all it would lead to is the deaths of many, many thousands of Russians and Ukrainians, which is obviously exactly the opposite of what we would want to see. So I do think there's still a lot to be considered here. And I do also think that we need to be very, very careful about ensuring that we don't really, that we're always on the right side, and the takes we have must always be very, very carefully considered. Because fundamentally, as I said, I wouldn't want to see this become a war of aggression and occupation, because if it became that, it certainly then wouldn't be justified.
Well, let's go over this, so you brought up a lot of very important points, good points, and you were talking about Czechoslovakia, which were Czechs and Slovaks, very different language, very different identified people, and it really is important to talk about some of the truth about the Ukrainian people. Okay, the fact is that the Ukraine was always really considered part of, the quote Russian Empire. And their genetic heritage, they are part of the Rus, actually the Viking settlements that came all the way down in Europe that became the elite, the aristocracy of those countries. And the interesting thing is that the Ukrainians are not like Czechs and Slovaks. They're not like, for instance, like you say, Middle Easterners. And the Ukrainians and the Russians have always had a very good relationship over the years. They have a slightly different language. It's almost like a dialect of Russian. Again, I spent 2 years in Ukraine at the university, and I love the Ukrainian people, but they had a respect for each other. They understood that the Holodomor, which was the killing of 10 million, and I think at minimum 10 million Ukrainians, starving to death and taking off to the gulags millions of Ukrainians, and most of the deaths were children. and the most defenseless, the elderly, who had weak, and they were starved to death, and they were also tortured, and the women were raped. And these were Jews that did it. It was Kaganovich was in charge of the whole Holodomor operations. They purposely were ethnically cleansing the Ukrainians because they had a sense of identity, and that was a danger to the communist global Jewish state. And communism was really part of the International, which was part of a global Jewish communist society, or attempt to take over the whole world openly. So the Ukrainians are, and the Russians are very similar. And we have to make something clear. The Russians didn't even feel any danger about letting Ukraine be together. Khrushchev, in fact, gave it to them. Later, that turned out to be a bad thing because the Jews were able to try to just change this language difference, because it's not even a DNA difference. It's not a genetic difference. And it's a heritage that they often, they shared. It was a heritage, a European heritage, and every Ukrainian, just about every intellect in Ukraine, in the history of Ukraine, they knew the Russian language and Russian literature. They knew Tolstoy. They knew all the great Russian writers, Dostoevsky and all the great. They knew Russian music, Tchaikovsky, and all these other Russians, and they celebrated that, and they had a sense of unity. 70% of the Ukrainians were extremely favorable even to Russia 10 years ago. But we have a global Jewish social media in the last 10 years, Facebook and Google and all the rest of it. A global homo Jewish broadcast media, print media, magazine media. They controlled the media of Ukraine, and they purposely drove these divisions between Russians. And by the way, Putin, the last thing Putin wanted to do was even invade Russia or even separate parts of Russia out. But he felt like he didn't have any choice because the Jews had developed this division between the Ukrainians and Russians, which is a slight cultural difference. It's not even a genetic difference. They're basically the same people, and they shared aspects of the Russian Christian traditions and the European Christian traditions, whether they were Catholics in the West or whether they were Russian Orthodox in the East, and they got along, and they treated each other fairly and decently. That was all exacerbated by these Jews because they saw this as a way to divide Ukraine, because certainly half the country spoke Ukrainian, even though most all of them knew Russian too. That was the official language of the country. They were educated in often Russian at the universities and so forth, and they exacerbated and tried to create these processes. So even the differences in the Ukrainian people and the Russian people are very slight. But this was all an attempt to divide and conquer. It's the same exact thing that the Jews have done in Great Britain, in France with the massive immigration, in Italy with the massive immigration, in Austria with the massive immigration, in Germany with the massive immigration, to introduce non-Germans, non-Italians, non-British into your countries, divide and conquer, and then incite the minorities against white people. And that's exactly what they're doing in the United States of America. This is the Jewish modus operandi all over the world for the Jewish, these Jewish globalist powers, these ultra-Jewish supremacists, ultra-Jewish racists that control major media. They control the international banks. They've infiltrated politics. It's like for instance, when we say America around in Europe, we say how many, it's American influence. Well, let me tell you, in every country of Europe, there are very few actual Americans there infiltrating the government or the society, but every European country has far more of another minority called Jews. And they are loyal, and they have organizations in every country, the World Jewish Congress, for instance, in every nation of Europe and America, and they're loyal to Jewish interests. They put mission statements out supporting the interests of the Jewish people globally and Israel worldwide. So these people in these countries, these Jews who have a lot of money, they're 25% of the billionaires in the entire world. That's a fact. And probably more than that, there are 50% of the billionaires in your country, Britain. There are at least 30 to 40% of the billionaires in America, with 315 million of the 330 million Americans being non-Jews, right? But they're 40% almost the billionaires, and they concentrate that money to control politics. So this is the thing we got to get into. Now, whether or not the last thing Putin wanted to do was invade or to have the military go into Kyiv or whatever, but they felt they had an existential problem with the country. If they were going to have American troops and American subversion and American nuclear weapons at their border, America was willing to have a nuclear war, actually, in 1962. When I was 12 years old. I remember it, though, and I was pretty well read even then at that age. And I remember those times when we came within 15 minutes of a nuclear war, which had been devastating to your country, Great Britain, devastating to Europe, devastating to Russia, and devastating to America, that we were willing to even greatly risk. In fact, we came within 15 minutes of a nuclear war with Russia, which had been a tragedy for European mankind, maybe a death knell for European mankind, because we didn't want nuclear missiles in Cuba just 90 miles from our shores. And yet here we have a situation where Russia is feeling structured. So the Russians would never have invaded, except for the fact that we had Jews in Ukraine, like the Jewish head of the country, saying that we're going to join NATO and we're going to be part of the EU, and we hate, Russia, and we're going to have American troops in this along the borders of Russia, and Russia's being encircled. Even though Russia's not a communist country, they're not trying to invade Europe, they're not trying to take over Europe, but they don't want nuclear weapons on all their borders. And that's exactly what they would be facing. They felt an existential question was. So the real issue is not about Ukraine. If the Ukrainians were not led by a bunch of Jews and Jewish control of the media, and the Jewish globalists were being fair and decent to Russia and decent to the people of Ukraine, this action, they knew the Ukrainians could not win this war. They knew Ukrainians would die. They knew that they were shipping out Jews. Jews were being taken to safety in Israel and outside the country. This is all fact. In fact, Tucker interviewed this Shlomo guy, this Jew, and they even gave his website how he's rescuing people in Ukraine. They didn't say that it was Ukrainian Jews, not Ukrainians. They're happy to have Russians and Ukrainian Christians killing one another. So this is the point. And Russia, to a point now, if they don't try to influence the country as a whole, and also they're even talking right now, Mark, about guerrilla warfare, terrorist warfare. So once the Russians kind of try to get a more friendly government, and they try to not have Ukraine accept NATO troops in the country, the Jews are already talking about, the Jewish media is already saying, we've got to continue this war. We sent, America, under the Jewish power, sent Ukraine thousands, hundreds of thousands of tons of the highest explosive materials in the world that were the size of a brick, could destroy a whole building, much less. One size, the size of a plastic Coke bottle, could blow up a whole house. The most explosive TNT type, explosive substance in the world. And we've sent that to them. We've sent them Stinger missiles. And what they want is a projected guerrilla war, a terrorist war. And of course, if that happens, and once people go back to a normal life and they try to go to work and you go to restaurants and you go out, how do you keep these radicals who are now being inflamed against Russia from taking Stinger missiles and blowing up Russians, and are blowing up any Ukrainians that are seen to collaborate with the Russians? And then the Russians responding. They want blood. They want to demonize Russia because that's part of the Jewish global objective, to destroy any country. And they feel that Russia is a danger to Jewish hegemony. And that's really what's going on in the world. And these are some fundamental points. So all the Russians wanted, and they said, look, all we want is, we just want a declaration that Ukraine will be a neutral country. We do not want to be surrounded by nuclear missiles on our doorstep, which America would never accept, right? Israel certainly says that's the biggest danger they ever have. They couldn't accept that. But the same Jews that support Israel, that support the United States doing the same thing, even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had missiles, by the way, in Turkey, right next to the Russians as well, right? And part of the agreement where they wouldn't put missiles in Cuba, it was signed, and we removed our nuclear missiles from Turkey. We all know that that these countries should not be militarized. That these should be neutral things. Wasn't a terrible demand by Russia, and I think that the Russians would withdraw from everything, even the Russians, as long as they knew and they had guarantees that the country would remain neutral and that the Russian populations of those countries wouldn't be attacked, that they would not lose their human rights. And they were willing to do that all along. The only reason they went in was because they didn't want nuclear tipped missiles on their doorstep. That is the issue. So whatever the Russians feel like they've got to do, if they got to control the whole country, because what you do, divide the country, you think that's going to stop them from supporting terrorists within the country? You think it's going to stop them? I don't know. They want a guerrilla war. These people are warmongers. They keep saying how terrible Russia did, but these people want a protracted guerrilla, horrible warfare, men, women, and children dying in Ukraine. These people are the enemies of Ukraine. They're the enemies of Russia. They're the enemies of the EU. They're the enemies of Great Britain, and they're enemies of America. And this is what this war is about. It's about Jewish power and tyranny and the destruction of European mankind. That's my rant for the day. So.
Well, I think the important thing is that whatever happens here, we obviously all want to see fewer white people perishing. The last thing we want to see here is another war between people who are essentially brothers. That's the important thing is we don't want a brothers' war. We don't want a situation here where you have people dying. That's not what we want. But the fact is, we also have to take into account, the fact that ultimately, or I believe, the people who are behind this are basically those who are in control of America. And whatever happens next, it's got to be remembered that the people who are orchestrating all this are miles away from any of the problems. They are miles away from Kiev. They're miles away from the Ukraine. And it's all well and good that these the people running the show, and as I say, we know they're not Americans, but it is they are the people in control of America. So we know who these people are. But it's very important to note that those people are not going to be feeling the pain here, that it is going to be normal white families that feel the pain in this particular case. And we're seeing this, and there are heartbreaking scenes coming out of the Ukraine of young men dying, of fathers saying goodbye to their daughters and their sons to go off to fight. And those men may never come back. That is a fact of war. That is a fact. Those men may never, ever come back. And we must always remember that what these people are doing, the global machinations of those who want to rule every nation, have real-life consequences. And those real-life consequences are to deny mothers their sons, or to deny daughters their fathers, or to rob wives of their husbands. And this is a very serious matter, because when you're talking about this, it always has to be remembered that whatever happens, and whether we say on this show that certain things are justifiable, or whether we say that certain things are in some way understandable, we are still anti-war. And I would like this to be over tomorrow. I'd like this to be over today. I would like there to be no further bloodshed.
We pray for that.
In this region.
We beg for that.
The fact of the matter is, when it comes down to it, we do not want to see this kind of hell being unleashed in this country or any other country for that matter. But the fact is, just as it was with the First World War, just as it was with the Second World War. What we are seeing here, just as it was with wars in Iraq, wars in Syria, what you are seeing here is a manipulation of foreign policy, a manipulation of people's feelings here in the West and elsewhere in the world to push a hideous, largely anti-white globalist agenda that is being used to create, different wars on the basis that ultimately those behind these horrific wars and those behind these events are the same ones that if they got in control of these countries, they would push equal horrors upon them. Now, war is horrific, but equally horrific is having your daughter exposed to men in the little girl's room. Equally horrific is the idea that white people should feel guilty for existing. And if those pushing American imperialism, if those who are behind NATO that want control of the Ukraine got control of the Ukraine, the horrors might not be as immediate as the horrors of war, but they are horrors nonetheless. And once these people are in control, there's really nothing you can do, or there's very little you can do to get them out of that position of control, as we've seen here in the West. And it's very important to note that for the Ukrainians, if they continue to think, and there are plenty of people within the Ukraine that think that the embrace of NATO and America and the UK is the right thing, if they believe that, it will actually be worse for them than the Holodomor, because they survived the Holodomor. But they will not survive American or British.
They won't survive the EU.
Globo
the way it's going for all of Europe. All of Europe is facing destruction, correct? I mean, in your country, for instance, they won't survive. You're right.
That's what the stakes are. And really, if you ask me today, where would I prefer to be occupied by Russia? Or would I prefer to be occupied by those behind the European Union? I will tell you now, being occupied by the Russians would not be as bad as being occupied by those who are pushing a white genocide agenda. And that's a very important point, because you can survive warfare. You can survive an invasion. You can, and that's happened multiple times. The Russians have survived invasion after invasion. Eastern Europe survived years of communist tyranny. But one thing you cannot survive is the complete genocidal destruction of your people, the loss of your traditions, the loss of your cultures, and the airbrushing of your people out of history. And that is what will befall Ukraine and the people of the Ukraine, if the globalists and NATO get their talons on that patch of land, on that nation. And that, to me, is far worse.
Yes. A good friend of mine, talked about something I've talked about a lot. And he said, if you want to know what this conflict comes down to, the system, the culture, the rule, and the evil of the two different empires, the EU, three different with America, which is, again, the Jew America, are the United States of America, because it's not really an America that's ruled by Americans and the interest of Americans. You think about this fact. Now, here's one example. We talk about global homo all the time. So in the EU, it is perfectly legal. It is not criminal for a parent to take their little child, their son, of 8 years old or 10 years old or 12 years old, and take them to a doctor, and it's not illegal for a doctor as well, to take that child and cut off his penis. I mean, I hate to be so graphic here, to cut off his testicles, destroy his
You've got to
ability.
be graphic. You've got to be graphic. I always hate it when people say, I don't want to be graphic.
Well, I mean, but this
it's like abortion. The only way you can get through to people about these serious issues is to be graphic, because they are so sick.
Well, let me make the point that cut out a little girl's ovaries, which is her ability to reproduce and have a family, right? To cut off her breasts, right? That is legal. Now, I consider the mutilation and the destruction of a child's reproductive organs, cutting off their breasts, cutting off their penis if they're a boy, their testicles if they're a boy. That is a crime that's equal in horror to raping that child, maybe even worse, because that's a permanent rape. That is something, not just an incident in their life and horror and pain and struggle, but they are totally destroyed as a human being in a real sense, right? And I believe that should be the ultimate. I believe a person that would rape a child or do something like this to a child should get the maximum penalty and punishment allowed by law. To me, that's as bad or worse than any sort of murder. Certainly bad as any rape. In America, that's legal for a parent to do that. It's legal for a doctor to do that. In the EU, it is too. And the people pushing back from that are Russia, right? Are Russia. So I mean, what is the evil here? Where is the real evil coming from, folks? This is crazy. Mark, thanks for being with me. That was our swan song. You gave a lot of very prescient and very powerful testimony and discussion in this discussion. I'm really thankful for you, and I'm thankful for your work. By the way, I heard you the other day interviewing Stryker, and you made a couple call outs for me, and I appreciate that. I really appreciate you. You're really a brother, and I'll thank you so much for your support. And also, I just want you to know that you have my full support as well. You're doing a great job.
Thank you, and I'll see you next week.
Okay, people, that's about it. Yeah, this is data, and I will leave with the last comments of this. You got a Jewish prime minister of Russia. You got a massive Jewish sex trafficking of millions over the years of Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, with a massive Jewish international organized criminal slave trade of white women. You've got a massive Jewish porn operation in Ukraine, which is one of the largest Jewish centers celebrated by Israel in the world. And you have this kind of stuff going on, right, in the Ukraine. And you've got Ukrainians knowing that the Ukrainian could not win this war, and that a lot of Ukrainians would die in a war of this nature, while Jews are being shipped out and flown out and bussed out of Ukraine for their protection. And Jews always never fight in these wars; they always create. Isn't this insane? And this is a war against Ukraine. It's a war against Russia. It's a war against Europe. It's a war against America. It's a war against decency. It's a war against freedom. It's a war against everything we believe in. I love you, and please support our efforts at davidduke.com and support Mark Collett as well. See you on Monday, and bye-bye now. Let's stop this war. Bye-bye.